Okay, let's take a look at our next area, Russia, or more actually in some ways sort of the Russias. When you look at this whole area, if you just look at the size and you see in this map, everything from basically here all the way over to basically to hit Alaska is Russia. You compare that to the size of all of Europe, and you can see there's just no comparison. Russia is just absolutely enormous in terms of actual size compared to Europe, and much more so compared to size like countries like Germany or France, or one individual country per se. So when you're looking at Russia, you're at an entirely different scale. The second part is that when you're looking at the physical geography of Russia, it's entirely different than Europe. It does not have access to anything. Most of your rivers in the Russian part of Eurasia either flow to the north, and so they end up being frozen into the Arctic, or they run down to the south and end up in like the Black Sea or the Lake Baku or something like that. So your rivers are almost all going north-south. They're not going east-west. On top of that, basically everything from sort of the markers going across here is Arctic. So huge parts of Russia are basically frozen in permafrost for all, if not, or most, if not all, of the year. So it's an area that has an entirely different environmental component. So large parts of Russia are basically almost impossible to access. Large parts of Russia, this whole northern section here, for example, doesn't have any roads. There's no way to get there except, I suppose, by airplane or maybe snowmobile or something. So huge parts of Russia, despite the enormous size of this place, are for all intents and purposes inaccessible. If you think about this for a second, you know this just by the whole idea of what the connotations of the word Siberia, which is basically this whole eastern chunk of Russia means. Siberia is that you're in the middle of nowhere. It's frozen, even more so than sort of Alaska. It's sort of like the back of beyond in a popsicle. And that's not quite accurate, but it's pretty close to being accurate. And it says something sort of striking that if you actually look at Russia, it doesn't have, with the exception of Vladivostok over here, there's no warm water ports. In other words, there's no port that you can use year round that doesn't at some point of time freeze up for part of the winter. This is one reason why the Russians are so aggressive in taking over the Crimea here, but that gives you access to the Black Sea, but then you're still choked by the Bosphorus Straits and such like that. Russia, despite this enormous coastline, most of it's frozen, so they don't really have access to much of anything. And this is, in Russian history, this is, and especially in Russia today in 2022, this is a huge part of a sort of the Russian view of the way the world should be, if you want to, and the fact that they have this enormous country. There's enormous amounts of resources, for example, stuck here in this frozen north section, but they can't access it, and two, even if they can get to it, they can't ship it out. So Russia's in a really peculiar situation compared to any place else. So the physical geography doesn't work in their favor. Large parts of the country are frozen up. Large parts are what we call in steppe tundra. Tundra in the north, basically huge flat expanses. The steppe regions in the southern part, which then merge into Mongolia and such. Again, large, very little water in terms of accessible water, and pretty much, sort of like the Great Plains, just enormous open expanses of space and grasslands from basically all the way from the eastern coast of Korea all the way over to basically Belarus and actually Poland. So you've got this enormous chunk of real estate, but it's not really very heavily populated, most of it, and most of it is just pretty inaccessible in ways. Even areas like the steppe region, like the steppe region that should be usable, don't have access to significant water resources. So even if you've got land you could farm, you can't get water to it. So it's sort of a moot point. So Russia is sort of like someone who was given a promise and the promise wasn't fulfilled. This has been an enormous source of aggravation, I suppose, for lack of a better term, compared to the European countries, which are so tiny and yet have access to so much ability to move stuff around, don't have near as much resources, but they're more accessible. So Russia's relationship with the West is never been particularly warm and fuzzy. Now, it's important to remember that when you talk about the USSR, in other words, in fact, even the Imperial Russia from the 1700s, that huge parts of what was Russia, which included until 1989, included Georgia, Azerbaijan, I think all the way through here or to Mongolia, were all part of Russia, as were all these sections here. All the sections in the south, and to a certain extent, a lot of these sections in the west, did not become part of the Russian Empire until the 19th century. So a lot of the expansion of Russia, in the sense of Imperial Russia and the USSR, it's pretty much had the same boundaries. And then even this modern state of Russia today, really only have a history of being part of something in the 19th century. And a lot of these areas, especially in the south, which are turning very problematic right now, are even more complicated, because unlike the sort of American expansion of the West in the late 19th century, where you had Native Americans, but they were so small in numbers, relatively speaking, that they were just swamped by the new migrants coming in from Europe and other places that basically were the quote American population. So the great move west, as we'll see near the end of the semester, basically sort of ran over the few Native Americans are sort of going like, wait, what about us? Russia is making the same move, except in their case, it's more sort of to the south in the same period in the 19th century. And very brutal wars going on in here. But the huge difference, of course, is that these areas had fairly large populations. And in many cases, for example, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, all these areas here had been part of the Mongol Empire, and they used to control Russia. So unlike the movement west in North America, where you basically had a large population and almost no one able to stop them, in these areas, what you had were large settled populations. They have a long history. This is the the northern part of the Silk Road. They had been countries. They had been powerful, world empires, for some of these areas for a long time. So when they're taken over by Russia, there's not a just a few people saying wait. There's large populations, different religions. They're largely Muslim, different histories. This whole area has a history of conquering Moscow. The Golden Horde, the northern Western Mongolian Empire, controlled this whole region for, I don't know, 300 years, something like that. So when Russia takes over this area, it isn't the same scenario as happens in North America. It's much more of a extended long-term conflict that never really resolves itself particularly well. This gets exacerbated in the 20th century, especially under Stalin, who was famous for moving tens of millions of people around in areas that he didn't trust. He moves a huge chunk of the population of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia out to Siberia and other places just because he doesn't trust the people who live there. Then he actually moves a large number of what we call ethnic or Slavic Russians into these areas, and basically these empty villages just take these places over. So there's a very calculated move on the part of the Soviet Union, i.e. the USSR in the 20th century, even Imperial Russia in the late 19th century, to at gunpoint and bayonet point, literally to move their ethnic populations out of this area, which is actually Russia in sort of an ethnic sense, into these other parts of the Russian empires. They become consumed. But again, you have large existing populations that you're basically moving them into at gunpoint. So it's not the clean situation, I use that in quotes, that you find sort of in North America and Canada and say the United States, where the populations of Native Americans are so small that you really don't have to worry about them in a technical sense. There's not really much they can do to you collectively. These areas, have a history and have attitude, and we're not happy with this. And you see this reflected with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990, and immediately all these places get their independence. And a large proportion of them, for say economic reasons, still want to have nothing to do with Russia even today, or very little to do with Russia as possible. Most famously, Georgia and Russia, which have been basically at war for, I don't know, 10, 15 years now, I lose track. So this is Russia's in a very complicated situation. And again, one of the reasons it wants these regions is these areas have a lot of natural resources, especially oil and natural gas. So a lot of the resources that Russia has that it owns are in the north and fairly inaccessible. A lot of the resources that would used to be part of Imperial Russia in the late 19th and then USSR in the 20th century are much more accessible. And of course, they're also bordering areas of large seas where they can move this stuff to the Mediterranean or to the Atlantic or whatever. So the places that get lost in 1989, 1990 have a huge impact on Russia's self-perception of survival. It'd be sort of like in the United States lost Texas and California and I don't know, I'll just say those two. all of a sudden, those economically, those two states are a huge part of the American economy. And if you lose them, and for example, Texas oil and all this stuff like that, then how do you survive if you're the United States? That's sort of the situation that Russia found themselves in post 1990, 1991, is when everything broke up. Is that what was left of Russia wasn't particularly, economically stable, you might say, especially since they had been something much larger and this whole network was set up. So next, let's take a look at how this network was set up, because this is really a key part of this. And this gets part of that whole discussion I was mentioning earlier about the Ukraine too. This western part of Russia, the section here, you have rivers going north and south of Volga and such like that, and draining into the Black Sea. And so what you had is, relationships to a certain extent with especially folks in Scandinavia, which actually ends up being a big part of Russian history. And so what you had is movement this way. Russia very early on, when it starts to sort of, formulate itself in the, sort of Roman Empire period, is basically gets very, very quickly tied as sort of an outpost of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we think of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. And what that means is the folks on the river, here's the main river system here, become the center of what becomes called Russia. More accurately, it's called the Rus. So the largest population group in this particular region is a group of related cultures that all speak part of the Slavic language system, in the same way that a lot of your areas here in Western Europe speak what are oftentimes called Romance languages, sort of land-based, if you would. And so in this particular region, what you have is a large number of groups in this whole region that are sort of related to each other. They don't get along with each other. They're sort of set up as almost like city-states. So the area around Moscow was one, the area around Kiev was another. So there are a whole bunch of these things scattered up and around here. Now, in a rather bizarre form, which then happens is that you end up with, if you want to call them Vikings, if you end up with the folks from this region, which called themselves Rus, they start coming down through this region. They were great seafarers and great users of water. So they use these river systems, and because they want to trade and actually work, and in fact were used as mercenaries by the Byzantine Empire. So they're interested in Istanbul and Constantinople. And so they would come up and down these rivers. And so very quickly, they become, ironically, sort of the unifying force. They come up and down here, they conquer these regions, they make them in the part of sort of a neo-Viking empire, if you want to think of it that way. And they center their power around the city of Kiev, which is now center of Ukraine. And then they expand that out. And so this becomes the earliest version of sort of the Rus as a group. So what you have is these Slavic populations. There's this huge influx in power and control from these guys over here, especially in Sweden and Denmark, coming down, sort of unifying these groups, even though they're outsiders, coming down, unifying these groups. But again, as far as they're concerned, for the purpose of trade with the South. So they're actually interested in Constantinople. Just this is how you get to it. But in the process of doing that, they then set up these, larger empires, if you want to think of it, in this particular region. So they're sort of doing their thing, having a good old time. And then what happens is the Mongols expand out of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc., and come tearing across this place and basically rip everything up all the way through part of Hungary, take over this whole region of what's now sort of the eastern part of Europe, and make it part of the Mongolian Empire, along with Turkey and everything to the south. And so all this becomes part of the Mongol Empire, which I think people don't remember is absolutely huge, because everything basically stops at Japan in the east, where it doesn't get to. And it stops at sort of Poland, Hungary in the west, and pretty much stops up here, in the north, and goes all the way down to Egypt in the south. So, an enormous part of the world becomes part of the Mongol Empire. Again, nomadic populations out of these steppe regions. So they're never very many in numbers, but their ability to sort of kick ass is sort of legendary. So they come and they just wipe these Rus sort of empires right off the map, and basically make all of them part of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols, per family systems, pretty much different fragment. This becomes the Western Mongol Empire, usually called the Golden Horde, Horde. I don't remember exactly where that comes from, but that's the name it's known as. So this whole Western area from Kazakhstan to basically Hungary becomes sort of the Western Mongol Empire. The Eastern Mongol Empire becomes Kublai Khan. And this becomes the empire that, for example, Marco Polo sees when he travels across to China, is the Eastern Mongolian Empire. So the Western Mongolian Empire controls this area for another couple of hundred years. And then the actual history of Russia in the sense that the people that define themselves as the Rus is getting independence from the Mongols. So to a certain extent, the whole earlier part sort of tied them together, tied, linguistic, cultural ties together under control of these sort of, Scandinavian, Viking influence. This gets sort of, temporarily stomped on by the Mongols. But then in the getting rid of the Mongols and sort of regaining their independence, they stay in these larger units. And so what happens is, again, for a lot of this period, it's Kiev that becomes the center. But then what happens is by the 1600s, is to the north, the area around Moscow becomes the center of the Russian Empire. But again, it's originally defined in terms of conflicts with the Mongols, and then later conflicts with the Scandinavians to the west, and then, not surprisingly, conflicts with the Ukrainians to the southwest. And this becomes Russia. So Imperial Russia was centered literally right on Moscow. And one of the side effects of this is that Russia, right from the beginning, probably was one of the first ethnic states. It was controlled by the emperor, so it was an imperial system, just like all of Europe and stuff like that. But because its original construction, if you want to think of it that way, was defined in opposition to the Mongols, who were seen as Asian / whatever, right from the get-go, the Russian Empire is defined as people that speak Rus, Russian, people that are Rus. In other words, they're part of the physical, socio-linguistic, cultural group that's based in this part from basically St. Petersburg down to Moscow. And so this becomes Russians. And it basically goes all the way over here to basically Novgorod is sort of the eastern edge of that. And so this becomes the state of Russia. This becomes Imperial Russia. And this is the Russia that exists in the 1700s. This is Catherine the Great's Russia. This is Napoleon's Russia. This is the Russia right into basically the 1917 revolution. And Russia at this point, always from that moment on right down to today, always has a real paradox. They're tremendously paranoid about the area to the east-southeast of the ex-Mongol Empire, because, till the 1800s, that group could still pop back up again and basically kick butt. So they were always worried about these guys showing up again. They're sort of like the nightmare in the closet. On the other hand, they weren't really part of Europe. They were part of a different tradition. They were part of a tradition that was based in this particular region. It was tied to the Byzantine Empire in the south. It was tied to the, expansion of the, whatever the Vikings brought into the whole thing. So its whole history was very little related to what was going on in Europe. It was an entirely different thing. And this is something I don't think people really understand: is Russia is not part of Europe. It's next to Europe. It's always had interfaces with Europe. In most cases, not particularly happy. But for much of this period, for example, Ukraine is a problem with them. Poland was a problem, and Lithuania were huge problems for the Russians for a long time. And so the Russian Empire, when it builds itself up to full force in the 1800s, very much sees itself under siege from everyone. The areas to the west aren't friendly. These areas are Catholic, for example, and these are Russia is Greek Orthodox. The Ukrainians, of course, are basically Greek Orthodox, but they're also more Catholic. And of course, they also see themselves as the original founders of the Russian state, not these upstarts. The guys to the southeast are Muslim, and they're also part of the ex-Mongol Empire. So Moscow and Russia almost start up with a pretty serious dose of paranoia. And you can sort of see this, because if you look at these roads, what's really strange about this, if you look at the European roads here, if you look at these European roads, these are networks of trade. So, you got Berlin, but there's places going everywhere because you want to get to Warsaw, you want to get to Amsterdam or someplace like that. So there's all sorts of ways to get around. This doesn't include the rivers, which are even more important. If you look at this area, what's really weird about this is the center of a spider's web. If you notice, everything goes to Moscow, but there's no road here that goes directly to Novgorod. There's very little that goes north and south. Everything goes here. If you want to get to Kharkov, you go this way through Moscow. So everyone and everything goes through Moscow. And this is because it's sort of what you might call the, fairly practical paranoia, if there is such a thing, of Moscow, of more accurately Imperial Russia. They were always convinced that everyone was either out to get them or everyone was going to try to break away the minute they could. And so you just sort of sat on everything because you were pretty sure that no one liked you and no one got along with you and no one was your friend. And so when the Soviet Union starts up in 1917, it takes exactly the same mandate. And it has exactly the same attitude. And, with their view of expanding world Bolshevism and stuff like that, Not surprisingly, everyone didn't like him. So what happens is when the Soviet Union starts up, it doesn't change anything. In fact, it makes it more so. Stalin's paranoia was legendary. Like I said, he literally moved millions of people around just because he feared he couldn't trust anyone. He also genocided millions of people just because he felt like, it was like Monday. I feel like, I don't like Estonians anymore. Let's wipe out a bunch of them. So in that situation, what you have is when roads become more important, when railroads become central, because you have to remember, rivers don't help you here. Even communications, things like telephone and such like that, everything goes through Moscow. And so right into the, even the post-World War II period, when the Soviet Empire becomes the other great world force, everything was centered about Moscow. And what also that means is the socioeconomic ethnic group that defined themselves as the Rus were never going to invite the other groups in. You were never going to invite your Asian populations from the southern part. You were never going to invite your Estonian, Latvian populations from the western part. You were never going to invite your Ukrainians as that once that gets swallowed up. You were never going to actually invite them to be part of this Rus because they weren't. They might speak a similar language to you. They might even be part of the same cultural tradition like Ukrainians, but they're not Russian. So Russian from hundreds of years back is very specifically a socioeconomic, cultural, linguistic group that, as far as they're concerned, also has a lot of sort of the heritage of this sort of this Viking thing. So, like the Germans, but even more so, there's a very strong sense of Russians looked like Russians. So, in many ways, this whole sort of German, sort of Nazis, Aryan race thing applied equally to the Russians, except in their version rather than Aryan race, which the Germans and Swedes and stuff were using for the Vikings to the west. To the Russians in the east, they would sort of see as the Russian, Russian race or Rus race concept, which didn't invite any sort of outsiders and pretty much was very aggressive that Russians had to marry Russians. They couldn't marry these other groups, even though they're part of the Soviet Union, even though they're part of Imperial Russia. They're not really part of the system. Classic way you see this is when the Soviet Union, becomes a big force. Being part of the Communist Party was basically your entree into civil service jobs or anything else. Almost no one outside of these areas could become members of the Communist Party. It was pretty much Rus only. So if you're from what's now Kazakhstan or someplace like that, you couldn't get into the Communist Party. Ukrainians couldn't get into the Communist Party. Just about the only folks in the Communist Party were folks that were from this region that were identifiably, sort of genealogically seen to be Rus. And this causes a huge amount of troubles because your empire is absolutely massive. And a huge part of the population of the empire is not Rus. The Rus are only in this little tiny area here. So everyone else is outside. Now you have to remember that unlike the American concept, which is based on sort of skin color and physical appearance, and the Russian thing, it probably had more to do with things like hair color and such like that, blue eyes, blonde hair, that type of thing, which was sort of the definition of the Rus, became, sort of the market identifier. And if you were anyone that looked different, you were just flat out of luck. So that's the Imperial Russian Empire, and that's the Soviet Union, is right from the get-go, way back in the 1600s when it first starts to form, is based on a very particular population that isn't even representative of the whole population of the region it controls. And because you're not talking about immigrants coming in, it's not like North America where they're British or French or someone coming into Canada or to the United States or something and sort of making the American or Canadian system. In this case, these populations are already here. So in that case, they can be very conservative about place and about membership and such like that, because we've always been here to that same mantra you guys have already seen for Western Europe. So Russia isn't part of Western Europe, but on the other hand, given the resources and the military and stuff, power and the, from the 1600s on, Russia has always been intimately tied to Western Europe, and in most cases with a huge dose of paranoia, which you can see playing right now in 2022.